Thank you, folks. Thank you very much. The NFL just announced that Bad Bunny is going to headline the 2026 Super Bowl halftime show. Can you believe it? For decades, the Super Bowl halftime show has been more than just music. It's been a huge statement about what America is all about and where it's heading, believe me. In the past, the NFL picked real icons like Michael Jackson, U2, Bruce Springsteen, tremendous artists that reflected unity, patriotism, and that great American pride we all love. But now, the league says they want to embrace diversity and reach a younger global audience. That's what they say, yet not everyone agrees, and they're right not to. Former racing star Danica Patrick, a tough lady, openly criticized this terrible decision. She said, an artist who doesn't even perform in English shouldn't headline America's biggest stage? And she even reposted claims calling Bad Bunny a demonic Marxist. So from the very beginning, this choice has raised deeper questions, not just about music, but about our identity as Americans. The real question is, does putting Bad Bunny on the Super Bowl stage strengthen America's identity or weaken it? I think you know the answer. Diversity is powerful, folks. It's tremendous. America became the strongest country in the world because it drew strength from so many peoples. It's unbelievable. Irish immigrants built our railroads. Italians brought their great food and family traditions. Germans brought industry like nobody else. African Americans gave us that incredible music and soul. Asians brought technology that's the best. And Latin Americans added energy and vibrancy that makes everything better. This mix created America's unique power. Nobody can deny that. But diversity is not automatically good. No, it's a double-edged sword, believe me. If diversity builds on a shared identity, being American first, it creates synergy. It makes us even stronger. But if diversity replaces that identity, then it fragments the nation, and that's a disaster. And that is the danger we see today. It's happening right in front of our eyes. So why is Bad Bunny so controversial? It's not just about the language, folks, though that's bad enough. He has built his image on shock, rebellion, and breaking all the norms. It's wild. He kissed male dancers on live television. Can you imagine? He wore women's clothing and makeup on magazine covers like it's nothing. Indignantly and angrily, he once snatched a fan's phone and threw it away in anger. Total disrespect. And his music videos often carry these radical political and social messages that are way out there. To the progressives, the leftists, he's a symbol of freedom, an artist who breaks barriers, they say. But to conservatives, to real Americans, he represents the erosion of our values, the idea that anything goes under the banner of diversity. It's crazy. When someone like Bad Bunny headlines the Super Bowl, it doesn't just look like inclusion. No, it looks like the rewriting of American identity, and not in a good way. History gives us big warnings, folks, tremendous lessons. Rome was once the greatest empire in history. Wealth and armies and power flowed into it like nobody's business. But Rome lost its shared identity. Citizens stopped seeing themselves as Romans first. They forgot who they were. The army filled with foreign mercenaries, loyalty fractured, corruption spread everywhere. To summarize conclusively, Rome had diversity, but no unity. And so it fell, collapsed totally. The Ottoman Empire faced the same fate. Believe me, for centuries, Turks, Arabs, Greeks, Jews, Armenians lived under one empire. Diverse, sure. But when nationalism rose and the shared imperial identity collapsed, the empire broke apart into pieces. The lesson is clear. Diversity without unity doesn't strengthen a nation. It destroys it. It wipes it out. And now America faces the same crossroads, folks. It's a big moment. Will diversity build upon our freedom, our responsibility, and the Constitution, the greatest document ever written? Or will diversity replace those foundations, leaving only tribes with no real American identity? It's happening. Bad Bunny at the Super Bowl isn't just about music. No. It's a test. Are we still one nation, under God, indivisible? Or are we slowly becoming many tribes, each with its own culture and agenda, but no real American identity? We can't let that happen. Thank you, folks. Thank you very much. Diversity can be America's greatest strength, the absolute best, but only if it serves unity. Believe me, without unity, diversity is no blessing at all. No, it's the knife that cuts America apart. It's deadly. It's a total disaster waiting to happen. So the choice is clear, crystal clear. Which path will America take? We have to choose the right one. We have to make America great again. Choose unity. Choose America first. And let's build that strong, unbreakable nation we all deserve. Thank you. God bless you, and God bless the United States of America.